Fishing vessel Great Northern Government Coast Guard, we are reading you loud and clear.
So welcome to Sea Views, and I am absolutely delighted today that I'm joined on the bridge by Brendan O'Shaughnessy, who's a commercially qualified superyacht captain. And Brendan is the author of a really excellent book called The Superyacht Captain, which I have really enjoyed. And you're writing another book which will touch on leadership, aren't you?
Absolutely. I'm a one-trick pony.
And I also have Tom Sharpe, who's retired naval commander and also a maritime commentator. Tom writes for The Telegraph, don't you, Tom? So, and anyone else you write for?
Yeah, I've probably been published by most of the national papers over the years, but I'm actually I'm not writing my own book. You know, one of the reasons I got Brendan's was to just have a look at that style and the storytelling through the years, because that's essentially what mine will be. It'll actually end up on the time I was in a ship that was flooding. That's the leadership hook, if you like. But it goes through the bullying saga.
And Adam returns with me as my co-host. Welcome again, Adam from Chirp Maritime. So hello all. Welcome aboard the bridge.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you, Julia.
It's great to have you here. Today, we want to try and cover this topic of toxic leadership at sea. Now, it in itself is a bit of a toxic title, isn't it? But I'm a PR person. I'm going to leave it in anyway, because I think it gets people talking. So toxic leadership, by that we mean, well, let's discuss what we mean, actually. So toxic leadership is our topic today. And I think both of my guests, Brendan, Tom, you're both going to be coming at this from different angles slightly, or with different perspectives. So I'm really looking forward to going through this with you. So maybe if I could start off with Brendan, first of all, could you just tell us a little bit about where you've come from and why you are here to talk about toxic leadership with me?
Oh, okay. There's a bit to unpack in a simple question there. So if I can do a potted history, born and bred Western Australia, joined the Defence Academy in Canberra at age 17 to go through naval officer training. I then stayed there as an officer watch for 10 years, enjoyed that immensely. Tried my hand professional yacht racing, found that I was good enough to race, not good enough to earn any money. So I went to commercial maritime for a few years, tugs, barges, offshore, and then I came across into yachting. I'm in my third decade of yachting. I came in, at the time, there were not that many with Master Unlimited licenses coming to yachting. And so I had a little niche there. It's not so niche anymore, but I came in as a deckhand to learn a new industry, and that helped immensely, and I draw upon that. On to the second part of the question. I think toxic leadership, whenever someone starts their parenting journey, no one ever looks into the eyes of the new baby and says, I'm really going to mess this up. But a lot of people do. And I think the same with leadership. I don't think anyone tries to bring toxicity into their daily leadership practice. And I think, having been there, why can I speak on this? Because if I look at some of my past outings, my blind arc sort of sat me fair in the middle of the toxic leadership barrel. But I didn't know it. I thought I was going fantastically, really doing well by my own measures. So I think it's very true, it's very real, but it sits deep, deep inside our personal blind arcs.
Thank you, Brendan. And Tom, could you just give me a relatively brief overview of how you came to be at the point in your career that you're at now?
Not dissimilar to Brendan, I joined the Royal Navy, this time straight from school, under a graduate scheme. So I got my degree through them, and thereafter I went to sea, and I was at sea for about 20 years in total, in kind of all the different types of ship that we have in the Royal Navy, from the mine hunters up to the aircraft carriers and everything in between. And that rotation, that cyclical rotation every 18 months, I think exposes you to not quite a unique level, but a very high level of churn and different organizations and pyramids, different captains and different departments underneath you. So hugely different teams, good and bad, leadership, good and bad. And I think what that taught me over the years is, well, firstly, how difficult leadership is to define, which you need to have a go at before you can really define toxic leadership. And I think one of the reasons leadership is so hard to define is because it's so dependent on the context and the person, both of which are almost infinitely variable. But then you need to have a go at that in order to know toxic leadership when you see it. And I saw it in one of my ships. In fact, in the end, the captain was removed from command because of it. So again, not a unique experience from my behalf, but quite an extreme one. And lots of exposure either side of that, good and bad.
Okay. And do you think we can actually tackle a definition of a toxic leader or toxic leadership then? Can we throw that one around a bit?
Well, I think I had a go at this, and it is difficult. But if your definition of leadership is the individual knowing themselves and understanding themselves and their strengths and working with that, combined with the context in which they find themselves, and this is where the divergence becomes huge, right? Because leadership when there's an incoming missile is totally different to leadership in a flood, which is totally different to leadership in a business, right? They're all political leadership. They're all vastly different things, which is why you get such extreme characters, sometimes doing it really well, sometimes doing it very badly. But I think the wrapper around all of that is empathy. I think empathy is perhaps the key word here, and your ability as an individual to really bring your characteristics, your personality into that context and transmit that honestly and with integrity. I think that's all key. And so toxicity to me is when that bit, or perhaps all of those bits, is completely missing. And certainly the thing that was missing in my one really bad example of this was any form of empathy, any form of understanding or sympathy to what might be going on around him.
So we've got to look at some of the impact, haven't we? Because there's a point where maybe we might say someone's a tough leader, or you might say a taskmaster, but there's a point where it tips over in terms of the consequences. Is there? That's perhaps where we're saying it's toxic leadership, where it's really having an impact on the people that you are managing. I don't know if Brendan wants to come in on this as well, because I think we should come to your story, Tom, in a bit as well, because it is the most extreme example and we should maybe come to that. But I wondered if Brendan had any thoughts on how do you sort of define it, because you can have tough leaders who are actually respected and quite effective but don't drive their crew or their staff to despair. But there must be some kind of point where it tips over.
I think Juliet really got it with that empathy. People want a decisive leader. They want that. And when you say a tough leader, someone who's willing to make that decision in the moment might be seen as tough, but that's fabulous. That's decisiveness. The one that shows empathy, a bit of selflessness, is accountable to their people. And just reverse all of these for toxic. If you as a leader put yourself out there, you make that hard decision. Let's use your word, Julia, of tough. But you're saying, I am making this decision. I'm accountable to all of you for this. You're showing your humility. They want that. Maybe it speaks to my upbringing, but I kind of see kindness, humour as two of the most important attributes. You're willing to let someone take a shot at you. It goes both ways. When we were speaking before we came on air, we were just sort of mentioning that willingness to put yourself before your teams and be humble before them and share and learn from your own errors is the attribute. I'm going the other side of your toxic leader. Just reverse all of these. When you are insecure in your leadership and therefore you have to defend everything and insulate yourself, that comes probably from a safe place. It's your own insecurity, but it comes across with a horrible toxicity. Probably back to our parent, no ill intent there. It's just someone who's tremendously insecure in their leadership that it comes out awfully. They get up on and speak from the bully pulpit. They disregard the input of others. Yeah, that's how I think. There's an extension of Tom's comment, to be honest.
I think the sliding scale is really interesting as well, because as you say, well, this is all a sliding scale, isn't it? I mean, this is one of the problems. There's no black, white, toxic, non-toxic. It's all a sliding scale depending on so many characteristics and the context again. But yeah, I mean, a really tough leader. I had a couple of those. One in particular I remember very clearly, but it was fine because it came from a good place. He knew what he wanted. He was technically proficient in all the aspects of driving a warship. And that's fundamental. To be a good leader, you do have to know, the basics. But it came from a good place. So it was fine. We knew what he was trying to achieve and how he was going about it. So we were able to put up with the fact it was quite severe. And the good man to go to war with, is a cliche as old as the Navy. But it is the center of our leadership training. That's sort of where it starts, right at the beginning, along those lines, with all the history and, dare I say it, baggage that comes with it. And that can lend itself to some interesting behaviors if they're not caught early enough in someone's leadership development journey.
Yeah. Tom, I think we should start with your example that you've talked about, and it's quite an extreme example of what we might describe as toxic leadership. Would you be happy to just tell us a bit about that?
Of course. This was about halfway through my career. I'd just done my year's warfare training, which is a year alongside when you're actually allowed to go home occasionally. And now I was back at sea and off as a warfare officer, so essentially charged with the operational capability of the ship, the fighting of the ship. So it's the start of the second half of your career, and so pretty important. And we ended up with a captain who was notorious for being toxic, notorious bully. And we prepared thoroughly before his arrival, which is an interesting side question. But we worked very hard to make sure we were as tidy as possible for when he joined in every respect. But it didn't matter. And what we found very quickly was an environment where there was no trust. I think that was probably the defining characteristic of him. He trusted nobody. No one was competent and no one was working as hard as he was. This was the sort of all-pervasive atmosphere in which we were doing our business. There was no coaching. Everything was retrospective. Everything was a telling off after the event. There was no preemptive advice, even though he was knowledgeable. It was all retrospective and all shouting and swearing and telling off. And what that did is it created an environment that made it impossible to take decisions. I was the ops officer, so third in command, if you like, and responsible for the warfare department. And I found myself unable to take fairly basic leadership decisions, because if I did, I was overstepping the mark. And if I didn't, I was indecisive. And as I say, I was halfway through my career. I'd had a couple of small ship commands. So I felt I was fairly confident in my own abilities. My small ship commands had gone well. So I was able to back myself. But the people beneath me, the officers beneath me, the junior officers, were really very vulnerable to this environment. And of course, it gradually got worse and worse and worse. And what eroded their confidence very quickly eroded their personal confidence, until we got to a point where everyone was stovepiping and trying to avoid him, and therefore actually creating the kind of organizational gaps that would then make him even more cross. So we had this vicious cycle that was becoming very, very hard to break. And I tried to break it a few times directly one-on-one, and each time it went spectacularly badly. So we had this really difficult situation to try and get out of.
This kind of level of aggression in leadership, did you see quite a negative effect on, I mean, obviously it wasn't good for you, but did you see a negative effect on other officers as well?
Yes. And actually, one had a breakdown, and then one was very close behind in terms of having some form of breakdown. Her breakdown was ashore back in the UK. So this started to, these concerns that I'd been raising on board through various channels were now starting to appear ashore as well. And this was the very start of the accumulation of evidence that in the end saw him removed from command.
That is a really tough situation to have to deal with for everybody. Brendan, I'm sure you didn't run any ships like that, did you?
You know what? I may have been guilty in my early captaincy of some of those traits, for sure. Absolutely. And as Tom was saying, naval officers study leadership as a large component of their career. Not many other, we're talking about seafarers, not many other business leaders study leadership at that level. So as you were describing that, Tom, yeah, that sounds like a normal day in most of the workplaces I've been in. That isolate, divide and conquer mentality, as counterproductive as it is, I think for many leaders it is a survival mechanism. Misplaced, really misplaced. And so when you said, did I make those mistakes? I can recall, and as you were speaking, Tom, I was recalling, first man into a new construction. The eventual crew numbers would be very small by naval standards, so 100-ish meter yacht, 40 on crew, maybe 65 on payroll. First person in, I felt I had the weight of the owner's interests to execute. And it took a long while to realise that wasn't mine to execute, that was mine to share. And it was a complete change to my current behaviour. If I look back at how I did it then, I felt I had to work harder and faster than everyone else. Because we're talking about the maritime environment, when you look up, let's insert, captain to general manager to CEO, for whatever one we want to use, but we're in the maritime environment. I had looked up at this idol of what I would want to become for nigh on 20 years. So when I finally reached it, I was still trying to summit this unattainable mountain of my own behaviours. No one else placed that expectation on me, just me. So I felt I had to be there, work harder, longer, which makes you more tired, more irritable, a terrible leader. But strangely enough, it was coming from what I felt was a good place to show that leader where, to be honest, I did say I started my career in the Navy. One reason I left is I didn't see those above me having a good time. So I now, which is my excuse to enjoy my workplace a lot more, I feel that one of my big responsibilities as a captain at sea is to show that the job's really fabulous, because there's a whole lot of guys working with me, guys and girls, unisex comment there, that should want my job. And if they see some ogre moping around, that's kind of invalidated their career path. Sort of coming at that from a couple of different places, I really identified with your toxic leader, Tom, and I hope I've completely outgrown his behaviours. And not to plug my book, but I know you've read it. I had a naval leader who was the epitome of a charismatic leader. I would have gone anywhere for him. Don't think I liked him personally. It wasn't part of the equation. Didn't need to like him. We didn't need to go camping together. So I needed to be led by him. I was never going to be the best the Navy had to offer, but I was the best I had to offer the Navy because of him. But I didn't like him, and that's okay. Did I respect one tiny compliment from him and I run across barbed wire? That is a different leader. If you are not that charismatic leader, don't try those shoes on because they won't fit.
Yeah, it's really interesting where you both identified how leadership isn't, you can't say, well, here's the book for it and this is exactly how you do it, because people are different and they have different styles, and it would have to be authentic to your own personality, wouldn't it?
I do think that there is a chance. I take a lot of sort of back bearings, look at a behaviour, then try and find a study that might back up why that behaviour happened. And I do think the study of your own or all of our cognitive biases really helps. And if you can table your biases, why you approach certain situations like you do, that helps the people you lead. So I think there are a lot of tools that you can drop into your toolbox. Communication, that is practice, that is effort, that is study. There are no born leaders. You study, you read, you try, you fail, you get up again and do it again. And I think that's the journey.
I think that's a really interesting insight there, Brendan. And I've listened to both of you, and I've thought, do you know what? I think we've all had a time of varying lengths in working in defence, and I suspect we've all gone through similar initial training. And when I look back at my training, I think, without being too contentious, the training almost forces, as a junior officer, you to be toxic to an extent, because you are scared to death of being found out by the people. You're leading a team that you just know when you wake up in the morning, have probably been in the Navy longer than you have since you've been alive, will know more than you'll ever know about their specialist subject. And yet somehow all of your training up to that point teaches you that you've got to be better, you've got to know more. And therefore, how do you display that? The easy way, and the way that many people I see fall into the trap of doing, is they try to make themselves look good by pushing other people down, by finding fault. And it took me years before I came across it, but there was this concept of servant leadership where you turn the hierarchical triangle upside down, and actually you were there holding people up rather than them holding you up. And I really liked, in fact, both of you talked about empathy, and you've just mentioned there about self-awareness and looking in your rearview mirror and going, how actually did I do? And I always found it really difficult to do that, mostly because if you're the person in charge, and I was always told this before I took over my first command at sea, was when you walk into a room, you will be the most interesting person in that room. You will be the funniest. You will always be right. People will always laugh at your jokes. And it's like, but that's because of what you are, not because any of those things are true. And I remember thinking when I walked in, actually grabbing somebody that I really trusted and saying, right, look, honestly, you've got to tell me. And then, of course, the first couple of times, they told me what they thought I wanted to hear. So I wasn't even getting the truth then. And I had to really work at saying to them, no, I really need you to tell me if I'm getting this wrong.
Can we identify toxic leaders at an earlier stage? Is there a way of actually identifying individuals with those traits or those behaviours earlier, either not recruiting them, or is it literally that we would have to think about just getting rid of them when they display that behaviour before they do too much damage? Any thoughts on that? Can we identify people?
I mean, I think the psychiatrist would say yes, but I have my doubts. We're talking about people sort of in the 18 to 25 age bracket here. Some of the greatest leaders ever were probably pretty horrible back then at that age. These are things that need to be developed. So I think weeding those characteristics out I mean, obviously there's extremes, right? But within the normal distribution, identifying them at interview, I think is not realistic. The pressures of initial training, certainly again, speak from Dartmouth, are such that some extremes get weeded out. But as Adam said, there is a sense of Dartmouth of strength, of fighting leadership, where manners doesn't matter and being polite doesn't matter. That's part of the thing. And we're terrified of indecision. It's better just to say something and press on rather than being kind of thinking about what's around you. That's the sort of practical leadership task style of teaching people to train. So step in and do and say something. And you see people who don't lose that in their mid-career. They don't lose that framework that the basic training's given them, making fools of themselves routinely because they now lack the ability to step back and ask their experts around them. And as we've identified, quite often the people around you know what they're doing, even if you don't. And if you lack the ability to harness that, I did see some people do it and I kind of admired them. The singleton guy who just knows what to do and how to do it and is utterly self-confident. But that's not how I led. I led with actually sometimes a little bit of skepticism as to how I was in the position I was in. And my first command was in a fishery protection boat, age 28. I spent quite a bit of that wondering how the hell I ended up in this situation in command of all these old sailors who knew exactly what they were doing. And I hope I used that to my advantage. So yeah, we definitely train people to lead from the front, but sometimes in a slightly awkward way. And they have to step back from that. And if they're not stepping back from it or they're becoming toxic, then that has to be identified and it has to be identified. That's the first thing. Then they have to be reported and educated and mentored to try and correct it. And then if that doesn't work, then measures need to be taken to slow the rate of ascent of whoever that person is. And that's where the Royal Navy does tend to slip up at the sort of mid-career point. Once the momentum is built on a certain set of characteristics, it can be very hard to then stop it.
Well, I agree. But to broaden this away just from the Royal Navy and to talk about the maritime leadership in general, I think one of the reasons that toxic leadership persists is that to their superiors, they're delivering. That's the hardest thing, I think, is because if you're being judged by somebody above you, if you are the toxic leader and you're always delivering to them, because there's this thing, isn't there, about kick down and kiss up. So if you're always looking good to the person who's looking down upon you and judging whether you're good enough to be where you are, they will always say, yeah, you're the right person for the job. And it's that, as you said, as that comment about seem to be good in a crisis. But actually, it's the people below you. And actually, I think detecting toxic leadership is more 360 reporting. But of course, that goes very much against the traditions of the maritime environment. In many ways, some things we do, even now, are quite Edwardian, and wearing physical stripes. And we've all heard that tale of, well, I've got 4 stripes, you've got 3, so I'm right. That's the epitome of toxic leadership.
That 360 reporting, anyone who doesn't know what that is, do you want to tell us what it means? Who's had it done to them or done it, should I say? Who's taken part in it? Tom, Brendan, have you?
Yeah.
Do you want to just explain for some of my listeners what we mean by that?
I think the answer is almost in the name, Julia. You're getting, by your peers, by your superiors and by those you lead, you're getting reported upon. It becomes a beauty pageant pretty quickly where everyone just wants to say nice things. But I do agree with Adam. You do need to find your truth tellers. I do think if this doesn't scale entirely, this can only be inside your own sphere of influence, unless you are a professional coach or mentor. But if you're bringing people into leadership roles, then if they fail or succeed and you are their notional line superior, a lot of their success or failure is a reflection on your own performance or your own ability to bring them up. At the moment, I have 2 fabulous chief officers who I'm working with. And we speak probably our dominant conversation is about handling their conversations. I even said to one of them on the last, I said, are you beginning to get frustrated with me? And he said, oh, no. I said, let me frame that. I really want you to start getting frustrated with me because our 2 Venn diagrams are beginning to overlap. I want to feel your captaincy coming through and your leadership. You might look at some of my behaviours. And when I gave him that frame to speak openly, he spoke on a couple of things. He said, well, the way you do this, I'm interested why you do it, which is a very lovely way of saying, I don't like how you do that, which is fabulous.
Yeah.
And I believe these conversations that he and I have both really grown to enjoy. He is a very focused young man, young leader, and I believe he was going to be one of those hard-driving, task-orientated leaders. And at the moment, sorry that this is going to be a quick naval example, but because a long time ago for me, I reported as a baby assistant divisional officer on 6 divers that I was in charge of. And I reported to the captain, senior captain of 330 people. And I went to speak on the first person, and I just glanced down at the file because I forgot his first name. I'd called him Nobby or some ubiquitous nickname. I couldn't remember his first name. Without breaking eye contact, this captain told me about the 6 sailors, their family, their children, and their sensitivities in the workplace. He did not break my eye contact. At the end, he said, I didn't do that to show off. You cannot lead your people until you invest the time to learn who they are and what they need from you. And it stuck with me to this day. I've got to go 4 to 5 questions deep with each person, and then you start to get some truth out. And that, if you start to do that, the toxicity in leadership almost doesn't get a bloom. It can't come out because you're getting deeper and deeper. You'll find someone's biased before they know it. Maybe it was a childhood familial situation. Maybe they say they really struggled to get through their Officer of the Watch qualification and they're academically very nervous. So that comes out in a very defensive profile. So you're beginning to learn, and I try to use the words of leadership I've talked about cognitive biases, saying about psychological safety in team performance and how do you give that, and give your aspiring leaders the words to frame their leadership in. Tom opened with empathy. So break that out to the guy. Say, what does that word mean to you? What does vulnerability in leadership mean to you? You just tell me about that. What does that look like to you in leadership? To me, that's become the greatest shift in my own practice.
But this isn't really in a lot of the training, is it? That kind of level of nuance of learning to be a leader, is that probably missing in your experience from the training that you would have just to comply with regulations?
SCCW training is there how not to get your toes burnt in a fire. It is not how to be a great leader on a vessel. All the way through to Master Unlimited, it is the absolute minimum to get through that has been signed off by all the IMO participant countries, which are the major tonnage shareholders who don't want to spend an extra $1 on training. So if you say that is your hurdle to jump, you're going to be really undercooked. Naval training come at it a completely different way. They throw money on it. They've got one owner of a significant fleet and they value it. Where commercial shipping and super yachts, you've got to go out there on your own. It's not going to be handed to you on a platter. It is not going to be your GMDSS or your ship captain's medical. It never will. The Helm course, maybe it's enough to open an interest, but it's just not in maritime training, and I don't think it ever will be.
So industry themselves would have to voluntarily step up to do that level of quality training if they want to?
I guess so. Aviation did it because planes were crashing. Cockpit resource management. Hospitals did it because they were accidentally chopping the wrong leg off occasionally. Theatre resource management. We do it in Bridge Team Management, BRM, which are 2 fabulous courses that can be extended as metaphors across your whole leadership sphere. But we don't assign a high priority to it, to be honest.
No, and you hit the nail on the head there, Brendan, as well, about, and this can be extended across the piece as well, the entire maritime industry, that the IMO set standards, but they are the minimum. But because of the unwillingness to invest and because they can't necessarily see a business case why they would, that minimum almost immediately becomes the maximum. And people tick boxes for compliance, not because they want to have happy crews. And I find this, there's a real dichotomy here because I hear so often that we are facing a shortage of personnel across the entire maritime industry. And yet we don't seem to want to invest in them to make it either recruit them in the first place or retain them once they're in. Instead, and I'm not speaking for the whole industry, obviously that would be very purgative, but there are some quarters where people are commoditized. And if you're not the good enough leader but I've recruited, I'll just get rid of you and bring in another one and hope he's better. Because that's cheaper than actually investing into you. So Julia, you're right. I think there is a certain element of systemic pressure that pushes us from towards the tough/toxic, away from the kind and more empathetic, because empathy doesn't deliver you a bottom right-hand corner profit margin.
Well, not obviously, not as obviously.
I'm talking from their perspective. You're right. It actually does. That's the real irony. When you've got better, happier, more committed, more engaged crews, they'll have fewer incidents. They'll go the extra mile. They'll do all the right things that we expect. And those are the things that a good leader should bring out. But to be a good leader, as Brendan has said, you've got to be trained in the first place.
How quick is your rotation, Brendan? So how long are you captain of a ship for on average?
It's a bit short at the moment, 28 days on, 28 days off. So industry standard would be double that, sort of 2 months, 2 months.
And over how long a period in terms of months and years are you on one ship?
I've kept a little bit to my posting cycle. I like a change every 3 to 4 years. Shakes me up. When I say that, I loathe the first 3 months of learning, but I'll take this back a notch. I can only speak for a bit of the bell curve. There are outliers at both ends. The last performance appraisal as a captain I received was in 2007. It was a 360-degree, 2007, because our performance appraisals are binary. 1, you're employed. 0, you're not. There's not much in between there. So when you have a leader operating with that binary feedback, and you'll be the last to know when that switch flips, very hard to be a confident leader. Just segueing across to the impact of it, it was really interesting to me that the NTSB for the US Coast Guard, National Transport Safety Board, when they did their findings of the sinking of the El Faro, do you remember El Faro? Lost 33 people off the coast of Florida. In 2015, we don't just sink ships off the coast anymore. One of their findings, the captain had not had a performance appraisal for a couple of years and was very insecure in his job. So he felt the need to push the ship harder, further, because he thought he would lose his job if he didn't make the cargo. So they sailed on into Hurricane Joaquin and sank with all lives lost. It was one of 81 findings, but I found that one incredibly powerful. That is the ultimate, Tom, that when you were speaking of your captain a little while back, he was on the El Faro that day. It was the exact same. He'd siloed everyone. One of the other findings was he was the only one with access to the weather report. The weather report was out of date and he had siloed people away. So that's kind of that ultimate expression of when it goes horribly wrong. 33 lives lost for no reason. So that's how far it can go.
That's fascinating. I mean, actually, you moved on to something more interesting in my original question, which was about the churn of the rate of churn of toxic leaders. In the Navy, if you're in command, it's unlikely to be more than 18 months because there's a massive queue behind you. And that's not long enough for the damage to really settle. In fact, quite often it happens once you've gone. So you go in there, you drop bombs left, right, and center, you break half your team, and then you've gone to a fantastic report because these people can generate results upwards very quickly. And as we said before, the charm and the kiss up, kick down, but then they've gone and it's too late. And then the next captain has to mop up. So that was the original question. But normally at this point, I then go into a bit of a moan about how the naval reporting system is not really fit for purpose. And I thought it wasn't until I heard your description then of the report. At least we have one. It's not always entirely honest, and it's always very top down. I found it very peculiar that I was in command of a ship with 220 people, and I was being remarked on my leadership by one person I'd met twice and one person I hadn't met at all. And the 220 people who knew me intimately as a leader were not consulted directly. I found that very peculiar, but I'll back down a little bit now because at least there's a system and it's regular and people do write things on you. Whether they're accurate or honest or not is another thing, but there's a process and a pyramid. So maybe that's a better system than the one you describe.
No, I do think, and when I'm piloting, one good thing, just as a quick segue, when I'm not doing the Superyacht thing, I keep my marine pilot's license. You go on a lot of ships. It's amazing how fast you can feel it. Because your eyes are up and looking. You're wanting to see how this ship's going to behave for you. And it's not just the bridge, it's on the deck. You can feel a good or a bad leader halfway across 7-hatch bulk carrier. I'm at hatch 3 and I know. You can really feel it in the behaviour of people. So interesting. I can't even tell you the checklist of why I feel it, but I'm sure the two of you would recognise that as well. Then you come onto the bridge and it's either a team or an individual, and you can just feel it instantly. It is fabulous how the difference that makes. And it's how, I don't know how you bottle that. Our last conversations, yes, you train and you educate, but how to share with someone just how amazing or how awful the two can feel to an outsider very quickly.
Brendan, you could write a book.
There's a thought.
Yeah.
I think if you're going on board as a pilot, then that's fine, because that is a genuine, surprise. You don't know anyone on board. But in the Navy, they know the reputation of the captain, and this, I think,
yes.
There's confirmation bias here. So how was it that no one stepped on board our ship when we were all getting gradually broken and didn't detect that there was breakage? And it's because they know they're stepping onto a ship with a high functioning captain. So they're set that way, and then they see what they expect to see. And that then becomes really dangerous in my view.
I think that leads on to the reporting thing, doesn't it? Why is there such a barrier in the workplace to reporting this kind of thing? I think it's across all of maritime, and I certainly think it's on cargo shipping. There's some real barriers to reporting it, isn't there?
I think it goes everywhere, doesn't it? I mean, look at the recent sort of political struggles with people accused of bullying, and claims come out and counterclaims come back, and it's very hard to define. And one person's working someone hard as another person's bullying, and so on. So you start from a position of lack of clarity. You can't say, that person is, it's just much more nuanced than that, right back to the very early conversations we had. So that's the start position. And then again, from a naval perspective, the reporting system just doesn't allow itself the sort of correction that should be applied to these people once they've been identified, if they're identified at all. Now, our guy, once he got removed, all his previous reporting officers for the past 5 or 6 years were officially summoned and interviewed. And they were all sort of shown what they wrote. Why are you saying this? And they all said the same thing. We knew it was a problem, but he was achieving results. And we didn't necessarily like the manner in which he was achieving them, but he was achieving results. So we had a word. Because that's it. You write it down. You write down in our system, you write down this guy's a bully. That's the end of them, right? That's the end of their career. And nobody wants to do that. Nobody wants to check a glittering career. So again, you get into this sort of self-perpetuating cycle where no one's entirely honest with anyone else.
Yeah. What about in the commercial yachting industry, Brendan? I mean, is there anywhere to report? For example, the captain would own that ownership with the owner.
Yachts are operated in many different forms. They don't conform to a standard ship model with a ship manager and a structure. So I'll give a generic response, noting that there's a lot of outliers. The generic response is you have your formal pathway to a DPA. Quite categorically, that is now on every notice board of every yacht to raise a dispute. We're getting much better, the yachting at giving gender pathways. Because if it's a sort of salt and pepper, bearded, middle-aged DPA who's a great mate of the captain's, you're going to ring him up to say that you're being harassed. No. So we're getting better at that. The forward-leaning yacht operations will have a non-official pathway, and they might be someone in the owner's office. I know I've always tried to reach out to someone in the owner's office to make me accountable, to say, guys, I report to this person. If there is a problem, that is who you can call if the problem is about me. And that, please try not to, because it's going to be the end of my job. But the point is, there are pathways. To Tom's point, you have to be pretty certain of what you're doing, because you're going to potentially hobble someone's career. And if it ever touches the owners and they feel there is a toxic leadership, there'll be an instant change. That's the ultimate decision maker. If they come on board, there we go. That's what you've got. If the guests feel, excuse this word, the vibe is wrong and the vibe is being made wrong by the captain, there'll be an intervention very swiftly. That does happen a lot.
This relationship actually, which is a little bit different with the types of super yachts that you work on, Brendan, isn't it? Where rather than necessarily chartered ones, they had an owner, didn't they? Mainly. That relationship with the owner, is there a problem with the dynamics there sometimes? I mean, I know you wouldn't name anyone, of course not, but there's not that many captains in sort of other sections that go to sea with necessarily the owner on board.
Sure. There's charter yachts still have an owner who will use the boat. There are very few. There are a couple of way outliers where there's a few boats just for charter, but fundamentally it's an owner that offsets some of the operating costs by charter. So it's the same across everywhere. Yes, these people are incredibly influential. They shift global markets. They are the absolute tightest nation group in the world, the billionaires. So the narrative I use, so I'm not saying this is the right one, I say, look, it is absolutely never in my interest to say no. So if I am saying no, please, I've put a lot of thought into it and just hear me out, even if you don't like it. And I find if I frame it that way, they're pretty good. And I also find you've got to choose your yacht owners well as a want-to-be leader, as they often have very long, multi-generational experience, more than a lot of the yacht crew. So they know the bluff. If you're not very deep and firm in your knowledge, and whatever uniform you're wearing, be it a doctor's coat, be it a captain, they do not accept any piece of information until they've broken it down to first principles and you have maintained credibility. So if you're coming to report to the owner, then you must make sure that you can break down your concern to the first principles and stay credible. And I often say in yachting, we do carry a cargo because that's a criticism from commercial shipping. Well, you're a pleasure vessel, you don't carry cargo. Ah, we do. Our cargo is someone else's ego, and we have to add value to that cargo on every voyage.
I love that. But ultimately, I mean, these are people who generally have a lot of people saying yes to them. So that's what I'm getting at as well, is it's that relationship. Like ultimately, you have to make the decisions on safety and welfare of everyone on that vessel. That must occasionally cause some differences of opinion with owners, but perhaps not in your...
No, it does. I've had some howlers where I've called it wrong. I often say, look, I don't want to... You've got to be very careful flying the safety flag. Make sure when you fly it, it's real. I'll say, look, it's not unsafe. It'll be really uncomfortable. It'll probably break something. But fundamentally, the vessel is sound. The vessel is seaworthy. But if we continue on this path, I expect most everyone, including yourself, will be quite ill, and we'll probably do 6 figures worth of damage. One last bit of leadership at sea, they want you, the captain or the leader, to make them feel safe. We got this far without saying that. Your actions, especially when we lead hotel teams, Tom, not everyone, commercial or passenger vessel, are as highly trained as navies. There's a lot of people on there, spa technician equivalent, who want to be kept safe, and they look to their leaders to keep them safe. And that's right up there as a huge goal. So I just wanted to add that one in at the back end. All of the rest falls over if they don't think you are keeping them safe.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I felt that's what drove me through my leadership roles, was coming back with the same number of people that I left with. Frankly, that's it. That's the top and the bottom of warship command, in my view. There are many ways that cannot happen, some of which are in your command, some of which are not. But if I could come back with the same number of people that I started with, that's a tick. And with so many people on board, sometimes seemingly hell-bent on making sure that wasn't the case. I had my work cut out. But then the second point is the legacy bit. You're not the ship. We have a tradition of calling yourself by the ship's name in the Navy because you represent the ship. You are the ship, but you're not. The ship's company is the ship. They're your legacy. And if you leave it in a better state than you joined it, and they're able to carry that on, and you've come back with the same number that you started with, that to me is success. And the ones I saw get it wrong over the years. And again, I suppose my final caveat here, when we're bemoaning leadership and talking about toxic leadership, my final caveat is to say that these are outliers. Most of the time, it's good people doing a good job and just getting on with a very abnormal business in a very dangerous environment. But of course, inevitably, we're talking about the outliers. Fortunately, there aren't that many. But as the systems shrink, certainly as the Navy shrinks and we have fewer ships, then the capacity to absorb these outliers gets less as well. So we do need to make more effort to identifying them early and educating them. And if that doesn't work, then removing them.
Yeah, I think some of this does link back to the training, doesn't it? Regulations are only the bare minimum, really. So it's quite interesting, isn't it, that the Nautical Institute are going to be introducing these courses that could help with managing toxic leadership at sea. So that's quite an interesting announcement, isn't it?
And I'm involved in that, but I'm fascinated to see what comes out of the Nautical Institute course that I'm going to help with. But I do think that, helplines is the bottom end of this. In between all of that is mentoring, and above all of it is education. And I think it has to sort of happen in that cascade for it to work effectively.
I think you're exactly spot on there. You're only treating the symptoms with the helplines. They are necessary and needed. But what I really like about the Seafarers Charity is that they're looking at some of these structural issues and looking at toxic leadership, which is not going to be an easy thing to deal with, but that's getting more to the root of it. So that's going to be very interesting to see how that goes. So finally, I always ask all my guests one last question, and I'm going to start with Brendan. So Brendan, if you could change one thing to improve safety at sea, what would it be? And you can only have one thing, I'm afraid.
Hours of work and rest.
Yep, done. Good. Tick that box. Tom, if you could only change one thing to improve safety at sea, what would it be?
Yeah, I would include some form of honest, open, and non-intrusive 360-degree reporting. It has to be honest. Anything that has a name on it will lose its effect. In a complex hierarchy of any sort, no one's going to honestly put their hand up repeatedly and tell their boss what they think of them. It's too competitive to make yourself that kind of a nuisance. So it has to be honest. And in order to be honest, it has to be anonymous. But it also has to be non-intrusive.
Brilliant. Thank you. Adam, I think you're going to stop joining me on this because I always go to you last, don't I? But do you have one thing?
I'd go right back to the beginning. If you think you're being empathetic, don't assume, ask. That's probably the best way of getting around toxic leadership.
Okay. I didn't know we'd be coming back to empathy, but I actually really like that. Sounds like the kind of thing that would be improved greatly with more women at sea, don't you think?
Well, that's a whole new topic, the podcast, which I'm sure we'll do in the future. But actually, do you know what? Just as a teaser for that episode, if we ever write it, is that we're talking about 2% of the demographic that go to sea. And, depending on who you talk to, the percentage of issues that they face are, 50% of some of the reporting that we hear.
So that's going to be very interesting to see how that goes. Well, we are coming to the end of our watch. I'm going to have both of you back, I think, for the point
definitely.
When we've got your new books available. So
Very kind.
Thank you. Oh, no.
2027, I'm looking pretty clear.
I'm a very good leader because I've learned lots from you all. So I'm going to ring the bell and then I will take you all off for a cup of tea and a chat.
Fishing vessel Great Falls, Aberdeen Coast Guard, we are reading